And welcome back. As we continue looking at Python, we've already looked at how to use a for loop, but now let's go ahead and look at the other type of loop that is specialized in Python, which is the for loop. Now, when we look at the for loop in Python, it may not function as we expect if we've come from many C-based languages. Python's version of the for loop is much more like a for each loop in Java. So if you have that kind of prior experience, you'll remember how a for each loop iterates through a number of elements in a list. Well, this is of course going to function the same way. So we can of course still execute a set of statements, once for each item in a list, or if it's a tuple or a set, we have that ability. Now, the for loop does not require an indexing variable, so we don't need something like I equals 0, because again, this is structured much more like a for each loop. So for example, if I have a list, let's just say fruits equals apple, banana, cherry, I can just say for x in fruits, and I can print x. And again, we don't necessarily need parentheses here, just like we saw with other things. We of course can put parentheses around this, but we don't need to. Now we want to look at some examples. We, of course, let's say want to loop through a string. This is a great way for us to pull out individual characters within that string. So for example, since we know strings contain a sequence of characters and therefore can be traversed using that for loop, we can do something like for x in banana, and we can simply just print out x. We can do this to do other things. For example, maybe we want to keep track of the number of vowels in a word. We could do something like that. Now, there, of course, are break and continue statements that we can use in these for loops. So with the break statement, we can stop the loop before it has looped through all the items. So, for example, in this version here, you can see I have an if statement that says if x equals banana, we break out. The similar thing is going to happen with continue. Of course, it's going to function just like how we talked about continue last time with what it's going to do. Instead of, though, of course, stopping the loop, it's going to resume to the next iteration. Now, there is a way to restrict how much data we pull in. For example, if we're looking at a list, we may only want certain elements. So we can use the range function to do that. So to loop through a set of code a specified number of times, for example, we can use the range function. And the range function returns a sequence of numbers starting from 0 by default and increments by 1 by default, and ends then at a specific number. So for example, if I say for x in range 6, print x, that means I'm going to go from 0 to that value. Now, the range function, of course, as I mentioned, defaults to 0. However, it's possible to specify a starting value by adding a parameter. So instead of just saying range 6, I could say range 2, 6, which means I'm going to take the values from 2 to 6. But remember, this means it does not include 6, because remember, it's just like how we've talked about with like arrays and stuff in the past, where we start at position 0. So this is an upper bound, so it does not include that number. So if I say 6, that means I'm going to go 0 to 5. If I say 2 to 6, it'd be 2 to 5. Now, you can also, of course, nest your loops. And you can do this with while loops as well, but let's look at a for loop example. All right, you can nest loops pretty easily. All right, so here I have another list. I have red, big, tasty, and then I have another list, which is apple, banana, cherry. And I just simply have for x in adj, for adjectives, and for y in fruits, I can then print xy. And, of course, that would then create that appropriate list that I could look at. And now let's go ahead and look at this with an actual example in code to actually give some more context to some of these things we talked about. So here, of course, I have a very simple program. Here I have a demonstration for how we can pull apart an individual string. So I have a name I set to Johnny Thunder. For each element in name, I'm going to print out the current letter is, and then print out that value. And then I have a list down here. It says list of names equals Bill, George, Fred, and Henry. And this is for each element in names. And then, of course, I have an if and an else if statement. So it's going to look for these particular pieces here. And it's going to just simply print it out only if those exist. So let's just take a look at this code here. So if I run this, you can see we get our code that says the current letter is blah, blah, blah. So we get Johnny Thunder, and then you may be a science guy. All right, so that looks pretty cool here. But what if I wanted to do more with this? Like, what if I wanted to add a break statement here? So let's just go ahead and in here, let's just say we want to have an elif, and we're going to say we encounter the name Fred. So let's see, ELE equals Fred. And if I wanted to put a break statement here, it wouldn't be hard to do. But this time I'm going to do a continue. And I'm just going to leave that in there. And what I want to do just to kind of help show that this is a little different, let's just add in a print statement in real quick here. And I'm just going to have another iteration. And what I'm going to do is, why don't we do a count here, just so we can kind of keep track of this. And I'm going to just add a count variable. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to say count equals 0. And what we're going to do is for each one of these things, let's just go ahead and say, let's do count plus plus, because even though we don't, or count plus equals 1, rather, we don't need to use a count variable, but we're going to use it for this. So let's just see how that changes. And you notice now we get an error here. It says type in candy. Oh, because we forgot to do our string cast. Easy fix. One more time. And now we get another iteration 1, another iteration 2, another iteration 4. Because again, we're using a continue here. All right, because it encountered the word Fred. And so it pretty much skipped this line of code that came after it. Again, that's just a good demonstration of how we can use some of these different things when we start working with loops in Python. We already saw a while loop. We've now seen some examples with for loops, and that's going to help us to be able to make, again, much more rich programs.